Every Sunday for the past 10 years, Pastor David Whitmore had arranged the same white lilies on the altar. Not for God, but for the daughter who vanished from her bed on an October night in 1986, leaving behind only an open window and a lifetime of unanswered prayers. The sanctuary of Hillcrest Community Church felt different in the early morning silence, before the congregation filled the wooden pews with their familiar hymns and whispered concerns. David moved through his preparations with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to function, despite carrying an invisible weight. He straightened hymnals, adjusted the microphone, and checked that the communion elements were properly arranged. The same routine that had sustained him through 3,652 Sundays of pretending his heart wasn't broken. "The flowers look beautiful, honey." Margaret's voice carried across the sanctuary, soft but strained. She stood in the doorway holding a stack of church bulletins, her auburn hair now streaked with premature silver. At 42, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that sudden movements could shatter the fragile peace they'd constructed. David nodded without looking up from the altar. The lilies were Lucy's favorite, had been Lucy's favorite. He'd bought them every week for a decade, a ritual that felt both necessary and torturous. "Mrs. Henderson called about the memorial announcement," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone he'd perfected for discussing their family's tragedy. "She wanted to make sure we included the prayer request in today's bulletin." The memorial announcement. Every October, they acknowledge the anniversary of Lucy's disappearance with a brief mention in the church newsletter, asking for continued prayers for their family and for Lucy's safe return. The words had become hollow over the years, a formality that satisfied the congregation's need to acknowledge their pastor's loss without dwelling on the uncomfortable reality that some prayers went unanswered. Margaret set the bulletins on the front pew and walked toward him, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. "David, maybe this year we'll keep it simple," he interrupted gently. "Like always." She stopped a few feet away, and he could feel her studying his profile. After 20 years of marriage, she could read the tension in his shoulders, the way he held his jaw when he was fighting to maintain control. "The Brennans offered to handle the children's service today. Thomas said you've done enough." David's hands stilled on the flower arrangement. Thomas Brennan had been his closest friend since seminary, the church elder who'd stood by their family through the darkest months after Lucy disappeared. Still, the offer felt like pity, and David had had enough pity to last several lifetimes. "I can manage," he said, finally meeting his wife's eyes. "It's what we do." Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of those 4 words. They'd become their family motto, their survival strategy, their excuse for never quite healing. Outside, car doors began slamming as the early arrivals made their way toward the church entrance, their voices mixing with the October wind. The basement of Hillcrest Community Church smelled of crayons and old carpet, a scent that had once brought Margaret comfort but now felt suffocating. She descended the narrow stairs carrying a box of craft supplies, her footsteps muffled by the industrial carpeting that had seen decades of Sunday school classes and vacation Bible schools. "Morning, Margaret." Beth Carlson looked up from where she knelt beside a low table, arranging construction paper into neat piles. At 35, Beth had the boundless energy of someone who genuinely loved working with children, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she moved. "I brought extra glue sticks. You know how the kids go through them." Margaret managed a smile. Beth had been coordinating the children's ministry for 3 years now, ever since the Whitmores had stepped back from direct involvement with the Sunday school program. It was easier that way, Margaret told herself. Less painful to watch other people's children learn about God's love when her own daughter's prayers had gone unanswered. "Thank you, Beth, that's thoughtful." Margaret set the box on a nearby chair and glanced around the familiar room. Colorful Bible verse posters covered the walls, and child-sized furniture created cozy learning spaces. In the far corner, exactly where it had been for the past decade, sat Lucy's memorial corner, a small table with her photograph, a vase for flowers, and a collection of her favorite children's books. Margaret's breath caught. The table had been moved, Not dramatically, but enough that she noticed immediately. The photograph of Lucy, 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning in her favorite yellow dress, now sat at a different angle. The books were stacked differently. "Beth," Margaret's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Did you rearrange Lucy's corner?" Beth looked up, confusion creasing her features. "No, I wouldn't. I would never touch anything without asking." She followed Margaret's gaze and her expression shifted to concern. "Oh, it does look different, doesn't it?" A young woman Margaret didn't recognize emerged from behind a storage cabinet, carrying a stack of coloring books. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, and the earnest expression of someone trying to make a good impression. "This is Sarah Mitchell," Beth explained quickly. "She's new to the congregation and volunteered to help this morning. Sarah, this is Margaret Whitmore, our pastor's wife." Sarah's face flushed slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. I may have bumped the table when I was getting supplies from the cabinet. I tried to put everything back exactly as it was, but—" "It's fine," Margaret interrupted, though her hands trembled slightly as she moved toward the corner. She touched the frame of Lucy's photograph, adjusting it to the precise angle she remembered. The books needed to be restacked. Lucy had always been particular about order, arranging her favorites with the worn copy of Goodnight Moon on top. Beth watched nervously. "Margaret, I can have Sarah work in a different area if—" "No." Margaret forced her voice to steady. "It's fine, really." She turned to Sarah, trying to soften her expression. Lucy was very organized. She liked things just so. Sarah nodded, solemnly. "She was your daughter." The simple statement hung in the air. Margaret wasn't sure how much Sarah knew about their family's story, but the gentle way she spoke suggested she understood this wasn't merely past tense by choice. "She would have been 15 now," Margaret said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Upstairs, the organ began playing the opening hymn, and the sound of voices drifted down through the floorboards. The first children began trickling down the basement stairs 20 minutes before the lesson was scheduled to begin, their Sunday. Shoes clattering against the steps as they chatted about Halloween costumes and upcoming school field trips. Margaret busied herself arranging crayons, while Beth gathered the children into a circle on the colorful rug. "Today we're going to learn about Samuel," Beth announced, her voice taking on the animated tone she used for storytelling. "Does anyone remember who Samuel was?" 7-year-old Tommy Henderson shot his hand up. "He heard God talking to him." "That's right, and we're going to listen to a special story about how God calls us." Beth moved toward the old cassette player that sat on a metal cart beside the bookshelf. The machine was a relic from the 1980s, its plastic casing yellowed with age and decorated with faded Bible verse stickers. Margaret watched from her position near Lucy's memorial corner, remembering how her daughter had always sat cross-legged. In the front row during story time, her yellow dress spread around her like petals. Lucy had loved the tape recorder, fascinated by the way voices could be captured and played back. She'd begged for one of her own for Christmas, promising to record bedtime stories for her baby dolls. Beth pressed the play button, but instead of the familiar narrator's voice beginning the story of Samuel, static filled the room. She frowned and adjusted the volume, pressing stop and play again. More static, then a click, and suddenly a child's voice emerged from the speakers, not the professional storyteller they expected, but something far more intimate. A little girl, speaking in the hushed tones of someone sharing a secret. "I don't like the dark room," the voice said, so soft that Beth turned the volume higher. "But Mr. Thomas says it's okay. He says God wants me to be brave." Margaret's world tilted. The crayon she'd been holding dropped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. That voice, she knew that voice better than her own heartbeat had. Heard it in her dreams for 10 years. Beth's face went pale. She jabbed at the stop button, but the machine continued playing. "I miss Mommy and Daddy," the voice continued, and Margaret's knees nearly buckled. "Mr. Thomas says they think I'm in heaven, but I'm not. I'm in the special place where God's children wait." "Turn it off," Margaret whispered, then louder, more urgently. "Turn it off." The children sat frozen, sensing the adult's distress without understanding its source. Little Emma Morton's eyes filled with tears at the fear in Margaret's voice. Beth fumbled with the cassette player, pressing buttons frantically. The voice kept speaking, each word a knife twisting in Margaret's chest. "I practice my prayers every day like Mr. Thomas teaches me. Maybe someday Mommy and Daddy will come to the special place too, and we can all be together forever and ever. Amen." The tape finally clicked off, leaving the basement in absolute silence except for the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing. She gripped the edge of Lucy's memorial table so hard her knuckles went white. "That was Lucy," she said, her voice barely audible. "That was my daughter's voice." Beth stared at the cassette player as if it had transformed into something venomous. "Margaret, that's impossible. This tape, it's been in our supply closet for months." But Margaret was already moving toward the machine, her hands shaking as she reached for the cassette. David's office door closed with a soft click, sealing them into the cramped space that smelled of old books and the lingering scent of communion. Wine. Margaret sat rigid in the chair across from his desk, the cassette clutched in her hands like a lifeline. Beth hovered near the window, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by nervous fidgeting. "You need to hear this," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "Please." David looked between his wife and the Sunday school coordinator, noting the way Beth avoided his eyes. After 35 years in ministry, he'd learned to read the subtle signs of crisis in his congregation, but this felt different, personal. "Margaret," Beth already explained, "just listen." Margaret's tone cut through his pastoral calm. She placed the cassette player on his desk and pressed play. Lucy's voice filled the small office, innocent and heartbreakingly familiar. David's breath caught as he heard his daughter speak about a dark room, about someone named Mr. Thomas, about being in a special place. His hands gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. When the tape ended, silence stretched between them like a chasm. David stared at the machine, his mind reeling. That was undeniably Lucy's voice, the slight lisp she'd had from losing her front tooth, the way she emphasized certain words, but the content made no sense. "David?" Margaret leaned forward. "You recognize her voice, don't you?" He nodded slowly. "It's Lucy, but this doesn't make sense. She never mentioned any Mr. Thomas. And what's this about a dark room?" His voice cracked slightly. "Margaret, where did this tape come from?" A knock interrupted them before Margaret could answer. Thomas Brennan peered around the partially open door, his silver hair perfectly combed despite the October wind. "Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to discuss the budget committee meeting." He stopped, taking in their faces. "Is everything all right?" Margaret's body tensed visibly. David noticed the reaction and frowned. Thomas had been their rock during Lucy's disappearance, organizing search parties, counseling them through the darkest months. Why would his presence upset Margaret now? "Thomas, actually. Maybe you could help us," David said, gesturing for his friend to enter. "We found a tape with Lucy's voice on it, but she's talking about things that don't make sense." Thomas stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. His expression shifted from concern to something harder to read. "A tape? After all these years?" "She mentions someone named Mr. Thomas," Margaret said, watching the elder's face carefully. "She talks about him teaching her prayers, about a special place." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "David, you know how children's imaginations work. Lucy always did have vivid dreams, didn't she? Perhaps this was recorded during one of those phases when she was fascinated by make-believe. But she sounds afraid," Margaret pressed. "She talks about missing us, about thinking we believe she's dead." "Children process fear in strange ways," Thomas replied smoothly. "Remember how she used to hide under her bed during thunderstorms? She'd create elaborate stories about why the thunder was angry." He moved closer to the desk. "May I?" David nodded, though something in his chest felt tight. Thomas picked up the cassette, examining it. "This looks like one of our old Sunday school tapes. We used to record the children practicing their memory verses. It's probably from before—" He cleared his throat. "Before she was taken." But Margaret shook her head. "No, Thomas. She talks about us in past tense, about us thinking she's in heaven. This was recorded after she disappeared. The office fell silent except for the ticking of David's wall clock. Thomas set the cassette down carefully, his movements deliberate. "Margaret," he said gently, "grief can make us hear things that aren't there." Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the worn leather. The church parking lot was nearly empty now, most of the congregation having departed for their Sunday afternoon routines. She'd left David and Thomas in the office, claiming she needed air, but the truth was simpler. She couldn't bear to watch Thomas dismiss her daughter's voice as imagination for another second. The Fro engine idled roughly as she sat there, Thomas's words echoing in her mind. Grief can make us hear things that aren't there. But she knew what she'd heard. Lucy's voice, older than it should be, speaking of things that made Margaret's stomach turn. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove aimlessly through the familiar streets of their small town, past the elementary school where Lucy should have been learning algebra, past the park where she'd pushed her daughter on swings that last summer. The October afternoon was crisp, leaves scattered across the sidewalks like confetti from a celebration she'd never been invited to. "Mr. Thomas says it's okay." Margaret's foot pressed harder on the accelerator. Thomas Brennan had been present for every milestone of Lucy's short life, her baptism, her first day of Sunday school, her 5th birthday party. He'd been David's best friend since seminary, the godfather they'd chosen without hesitation, the godfather who'd had his own key to their house. Margaret pulled into the empty parking lot of Riverside Elementary and shut off the engine. In the fall, sudden quiet, memories began surfacing like bodies from a lake. Thomas arriving early for dinner parties, claiming he wanted to help with preparations, finding him in Lucy's room, reading her bedtime stories when Margaret came upstairs. His explanation had been innocent enough. David was tied up with a church emergency, and Lucy had been fussy. But now she remembered the way Lucy had clung to her afterward, unusually quiet for the rest of the evening. There were other moments, too. Thomas volunteering to babysit when Margaret had her women's Bible study meetings, Lucy's behavior changes, the sudden bedwetting, the nightmares that she couldn't quite articulate. Margaret had chalked it up to normal childhood phases. But what if he says God wants me to be brave? Margaret's breath came in short gasps. Thomas had always been demonstrative with the children in their congregation, quick to ruffle hair and offer hugs. Everyone said he was a natural with kids, despite never having children of his own. His wife, Helen, had died young, and Thomas had channeled his paternal instincts into church work, or so they'd all believed. Margaret fumbled for her purse and pulled out the small notebook she used for grocery lists. Her hands shook as she began writing down everything she could remember. The nights Thomas had stayed late at their house, the times he'd taken Lucy on special outings to give Margaret and David time alone, the way he'd always insisted on tucking Lucy in when he babysat, claiming it was part of their special routine. She'd been grateful for his help. A single mother in the congregation struggling with 3 kids had once joked that Thomas was better with children than most actual fathers. The comment had made Margaret smile then, now it made her sick. The notebook fell from her hands as she doubled over, dry heaving. 10 years. 10 years of grieving her daughter, of believing some stranger had stolen her from her bed. 10 years of Thomas comforting them, organizing prayer vigils, helping them maintain hope. Margaret wiped her mouth and started the car. She needed to get home, needed to think clearly about what she'd discovered. But as she backed out of the parking lot, one thought crystallized with terrifying clarity. If Thomas had taken Lucy, she might still be alive. The basement steps creaked under Margaret's weight as she descended into the familiar darkness, her flashlight casting dancing shadows. Across the concrete walls, David was upstairs in his study, preparing for next week's sermon on trust and faith, words that now felt like mockery in her mouth. She'd waited until he was thoroughly absorbed in his work before slipping down here. The basement had always been David's domain, filled with boxes of old sermons, theological journals, and the accumulated debris of 20 years in ministry. She'd rarely ventured down except to do laundry, respecting his need for a private space to think and pray. Now that respect felt like willful blindness. Margaret moved systematically through the storage area, her flashlight beam sweeping across, labeled boxes. Seminary Notes 1975-1978. Christmas Programs 1982-1989. Youth Ministry Materials. Each box represented a different phase of their life together, their shared commitment to serving God and their community. She found what she was looking for in the far corner, behind David's old weight bench, a stack of unmarked boxes that seemed deliberately hidden. The first box she opened contained cassette tapes, dozens of them, with dates written in David's careful handwriting. Her heart hammered as she read the labels. October 1986, November 1986, December 1986, all dates after Lucy's disappearance. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled out the October tape and inserted it into the small cassette player she'd brought. Down. The familiar whir of magnetic tape filled the silence, followed by David's voice, soft and coaxing. "Lucy, sweetheart, can you tell Daddy about your special room?" Margaret's legs gave out and she sank onto the cold concrete floor. Her daughter's voice responded, sounding exactly as it had on the Sunday school tape, older than 5 speaking, with the careful pronunciation of a child trying to please an adult. "It's pink, Daddy, like you promised. And there's a bed with princess sheets and books and the dollhouse you made me." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, bile rising in her throat. David's voice continued, gentle and paternal, in a way that made her skin crawl. "And you remember our special rules, don't you, Princess, about keeping our secrets safe?" "Yes, Daddy, I remember. This is our special place where we can be together forever. And I can't tell anyone because they wouldn't understand about God's plan." The flashlight slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, clattering across the floor. In the sudden darkness, she could hear David moving around upstairs, his footsteps crossing. The living room above her head. The same man who'd held her while she sobbed over their missing daughter. The same man who'd led prayer services for Lucy's safe return. Margaret fumbled for the flashlight, her breath coming in sharp gasps. There were more tapes, months and months of them. Years of conversations between David and their daughter, who was supposed to be dead but was clearly alive, clearly captive, clearly being systematically manipulated by the man Margaret had trusted with her life. She grabbed several tapes at random, stuffing them into her jacket pockets. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more horrible than the last. Where was Lucy now? Was she still alive? Had David? Footsteps on the stairs above. Margaret froze, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain David would hear it. She quickly closed the box and pushed it back into position, switching off the cassette player just as David's voice called down. "Margaret, are you down there? I thought I heard something." She cleared her throat, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Just getting some cleaning supplies," she called back, grabbing a bottle of detergent from a nearby shelf. "I'll be right." "Hup. Dinner's ready when you are," David said, his tone warm and loving. The same tone she'd heard on the tape, speaking to their daughter who was supposed to be in heaven. Margaret climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, the stolen tapes burning against her ribs like brands. At the top, David waited with a gentle smile, the same expression he'd worn through 10 years of shared grief. "Find what you needed?" he asked, taking her hand. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She let him lead her to the kitchen, where he'd set 2 places at their small table, the same table where they'd eaten countless meals while mourning their daughter, who had been alive all along. Margaret sat in the dusty records room of Hillcrest, community church at 7 in the morning, surrounded by filing cabinets that held decades of church history. She'd told David she was organizing old files for the annual report, a lie that came easier than she'd expected. The tapes from the basement were hidden in her purse, their weight a constant reminder of the nightmare her life had become. She pulled out the church directories from 1985 and 1986, cross-referencing names with Sunday school rosters. There had to be a pattern, something that would explain how David and Thomas had operated without detection. Her finger traced down the lists of children's names, many of them now adults with families of their own, the Hendersons, the Carlsons, the Mitchells. All families who'd been pillars of the congregation, trusted David implicitly with their children's spiritual development. Margaret's chest tightened as she remembered David's special ministry, the private counseling sessions he'd conducted, with select children who showed exceptional spiritual sensitivity. She'd been proud of his dedication then. At the public library, Margaret found herself in front of a computer for the first time in years, hunting through archived newspaper articles. She'd remembered Helena Morrison, a church member who'd left, suddenly in 1987 with her daughter Emma. At the time, David had explained it as a family crisis. Helena's husband had found work in another state, and they'd needed to relocate quickly. Now Margaret wondered if there had been another reason. It took 3 calls to directory assistance before she tracked down Helena's new number in Portland. "Helena, this is Margaret Whitmore from Hillcrest." "Church?" The silence on the other end stretched so long Margaret thought the connection had failed. "Margaret." Helena's voice was carefully neutral. "It's been a long time. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town, neutral territory, where they were unlikely to encounter anyone from the congregation." Helena arrived looking older than her years, her brown hair streaked with premature grey, and her eyes holding the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "How you said it was about Lucy," Helena said, settling into the booth across from Margaret. "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry." Margaret pulled out one of the tapes, setting it on the scratched Formica table between them. "She's not dead, Helena. I found recordings. David was keeping her somewhere, and I think Thomas was involved too." Helena's face went pale. Her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. "Oh, God, I was afraid of this." "You knew?" "I suspected." Helena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Emma started having nightmares in 1986. She'd wake up screaming about the prayer room and special lessons with Pastor David. When I asked her about it, she said I couldn't understand because I wasn't chosen by God like she was." Margaret felt sick. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I tried." Helena's laugh was bitter. "I went to the church board, told them I was concerned about David's private sessions with the children. Thomas Brennan himself sat me down and explained how spiritual counseling worked, how some children needed extra guidance to develop their relationship with God. He made me feel like I was interfering with my daughter's salvation." The coffee shop seemed to shrink around them, the ordinary sounds of conversation and clinking dishes fading into background noise. "But you left anyway," Margaret said. Helena nodded. "Emma got worse. She started talking about how God wanted her to be special for Pastor David, how she was going to help save other children by teaching them to be good. I packed us up one night and drove straight to Portland. I never looked back." Margaret's hands clenched around her coffee cup. "Helena, there were other children, weren't there? The special ministry children." "At least 6 that I knew of," Helena whispered. "All between 5 and 8 years old, all from families that David had particular influence over." The weight of it crashed over Margaret like a cold wave. This wasn't just about Lucy. This was systematic, organized, and it had been happening under her nose for years. "I have to go to the police," Margaret said. Helena reached across the table and grabbed her wrist. "Be careful, Margaret. David has a lot of friends in this town. People who won't want to believe what you're telling them." Margaret slipped into the church through the back entrance, while David's voice echoed from the sanctuary above, delivering his Wednesday evening sermon on forgiveness. The irony wasn't lost on her. He was speaking about God's mercy while she crept through the building like a thief, searching for evidence of his sins. The basement was darker than usual, only the emergency lighting casting long shadows across the familiar Sunday school room. She'd brought a small flashlight and the tapes from David's basement, planning to search for more evidence while the congregation was safely occupied upstairs. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs made her freeze. Someone was coming down, moving carefully in the darkness. Margaret switched off her flashlight and pressed herself behind the supply cabinet, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. Thomas Brennan appeared at the bottom of the stairs, carrying a small suitcase and moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. He didn't turn on the main lights, instead pulling out a pocket flashlight and heading directly toward the storage room at the far end of the basement. Margaret had never paid much attention to that room. She'd assumed it held old church furniture and seasonal decorations. But now she watched Thomas produce a key from his pocket and unlock a door she'd never seen opened. The click of the lock seemed to echo through the silence. Margaret crept closer, keeping to the shadows. Through the partially opened door, she could see Thomas arranging items from his suitcase, Food containers, bottles of water, what looked like children's clothing. Her blood turned to ice. "I know you're there, Margaret." Thomas's voice was calm, almost conversational. He didn't turn around, just continued his methodical unpacking. "You've been asking questions. Helena Morrison called to warn me." Margaret stepped into the light, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Where is she, Thomas? Where's my daughter?" Now he did turn, and the expression on his weathered face was almost gentle. "She's safe, Margaret. She's been safe all along." "Safe?" The word came out as a strangled cry. "You kidnapped my child." Thomas shook his head slowly. "We saved her, Margaret. David and I, we saved her from a world that would have corrupted. Her innocence. She's been living as God intended, pure and protected." Margaret lunged forward, but Thomas caught her wrists with surprising strength. Now. Let's not wake the congregation with unnecessary noise." "She's here, isn't she?" Margaret struggled against his grip. "In this building, that's why you have the key, why you're bringing food." Thomas's smile was benevolent, the same expression he'd worn while comforting her through 10 years of grief. "Lucy is exactly where she belongs, Margaret. She understands her purpose now. She's 15, you know. A beautiful young woman who's learned to embrace God's plan for her life." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. 15. Lucy had lived 10 years in captivity, while Margaret mourned an empty grave. "David's been preparing her," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon, "teaching her about her special role in God's design. She's ready now to fulfill her destiny, to bring new life into our sacred community." Margaret's stomach lurched. "What are you talking about?" "Children, Margaret. Pure children, born of pure love, raised in the light of divine truth. Lucy understands her calling now." Margaret wrenched free from his grasp and stumbled backward. "You're insane. Both of you are monsters." Thomas's expression hardened. "We are servants of God's will, and you, Margaret, are an obstacle that needs to be removed." He reached into his jacket, and Margaret saw the glint of metal. Above them, David's voice continued preaching about mercy and redemption, while Thomas Brennan pulled a gun from his coat. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," Thomas said, his finger finding the trigger. "But Lucy's protection requires certain sacrifices." Margaret backed toward the stairs, her mind racing. If she screamed, would anyone hear her over David's sermon? If she ran, would Thomas shoot her in the back? And if she died here, would anyone ever find Lucy? The questions swirled through her mind as Thomas raised the weapon, his face calm and resolved. The gunshot that Margaret expected never came. Instead, she heard Thomas curse as his phone began ringing, the shrill sound echoing through the basement. His moment of distraction was all she needed. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass vase from Lucy's memorial corner, and hurled it at his head. Thomas stumbled, the gun clattering across the concrete floor. Margaret dove for it, her fingers closing around cold metal just as Thomas lunged toward her. She rolled away, the weapon heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. "Stay back," she gasped, pointing the gun at him with trembling arms. "Don't move." Thomas raised his hands, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. His phone continued ringing, and through the basement ceiling, Margaret could hear David's sermon faltering upstairs. Something was wrong. "The police are already here, aren't they?" Margaret said, pieces clicking into place. "That's why you came down here. Someone called them." Thomas's expression shifted from rage to resignation. "Helena Morrison has a big mouth." Margaret kept the gun trained on him as she moved toward the storage room he'd unlocked. "Where is she, Thomas? Show me where my daughter is." "You don't understand what you're asking for," Thomas said, his voice suddenly tired. 10 years, Margaret. She's not the little girl you remember." "Show me." Thomas led her deeper into the storage room, past shelves of dusty Christmas decorations and broken pews. At the back wall, he pressed his hand against what looked like solid paneling. A section swung inward, revealing a narrow corridor lit by soft pink bulbs. The smell hit her first. A mixture of disinfectant, stale air, and something else. Human habitation in a space that had never seen sunlight. Margaret's legs nearly gave out as she saw the careful construction, the soundproofing, the ventilation system that must have taken months to install. "We built it during the church renovation in 1987, Thomas said quietly. "David designed it, said it was God's will. Margaret pushed past him into the corridor, her heart pounding. The pink lights cast everything in an otherworldly glow, like walking through a child's nightmare. At the end of the passage was another door, this one painted white with small crosses carved into the wood. "Lucy," Margaret called, her voice breaking. "Lucy, it's Mummy." Silence. Then the sound of movement, and a voice that was Lucy's but deeper, older, cautious. "Daddy said you were dead." Margaret pressed her face against the door, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not dead, baby. I'm here. I've been looking for you for 10 years. The lock clicked from inside, and the door opened to reveal a young woman with Margaret's auburn hair and David's green eyes. Lucy, though she was Lucy no longer, but someone else entirely, shaped by a decade of captivity and manipulation. The room behind her was a perverse mockery of a little girl's bedroom, pink walls covered with religious imagery. A single bed with princess sheets, toys arranged with obsessive neatness. Books about purity and divine purpose lined makeshift shelves. A recording device sat on a small table, its red light blinking. "Mommy?" Lucy's voice was uncertain, like she was testing the word. "You look older." Margaret wanted to rush forward, to gather her daughter in her arms, but something in Lucy's posture held her back. The girl stood rigid, hands clasped in front of her like she was preparing for prayer. "I am older, sweetheart. We both are." Margaret's voice was gentle, the tone she'd used when Lucy was 5 and afraid of thunderstorms. "I've missed you so much." Above them, heavy footsteps echoed through the church. Voices shouted orders. The police had arrived, and Margaret could hear David's voice raised in protest. Lucy's eyes darted between Margaret and Thomas, confusion and fear warring across her features. "Is Daddy in trouble? Did I do something wrong?" The question broke Margaret's heart. Even now, after everything that had been done to her, Lucy's first concern was whether she'd disappointed her captors. "No, baby," Margaret whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong. Nothing that happened to you was your fault." Thomas moved behind her. "Lucy, tell your mother about our sacred purpose. Tell her why you chose to stay." Lucy's face brightened with the practiced smile of someone who'd learned to perform survival. "We're building God's perfect family," she recited. "I'm going to have babies who will know only purity and love, and they'll help us save the world." Margaret's knees buckled. The full horror of what David and Thomas had planned crashed over her like a physical blow. They hadn't just stolen her daughter. They'd spent 10 years breaking her down and rebuilding her as an instrument of their twisted faith. The sound of splintering wood echoed from the main basement. The police had found the entrance. The police flooded into the hidden corridor with flashlights and urgent voices, their boots echoing off the narrow walls. Detective Sarah Rodriguez was the first to reach Margaret, who sat on the floor outside Lucy's room with her arms wrapped around her. "Daughter." The girl remained stiff in her mother's embrace, her eyes darting between the strangers with barely contained panic. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Rodriguez. We need to get you both out of here so the crime scene team can process everything." Her voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone who'd seen too many horrors to be shocked by another. Lucy pulled away from Margaret, pressing herself against the doorframe of her prison. "These people aren't supposed to be here," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Daddy said strangers would hurt me, that they don't understand God's plan." "Lucy, these are police officers," Margaret said carefully. "They're here to help us." "Help?" Lucy's laugh was sharp, unnatural. "I don't need help. I'm exactly where God wants me to be. Daddy explained everything. The outside world is full of sin and corruption. This is my sanctuary." Rodriguez exchanged glances with the other officers. Margaret could see the recognition in their eyes. They'd dealt with victims of long-term psychological manipulation before. Lucy wasn't going to come willingly. Above them, the sounds of David's arrest filtered down through the floorboards. His voice carried clearly as he shouted about religious persecution and the sanctity of his calling. Margaret heard his footsteps, being forced across the sanctuary floor, the same floor where he delivered sermons about love and protection while keeping their daughter prisoner 20 feet below. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rodriguez said quietly, "we've called for an ambulance. Lucy needs to be examined by medical professionals." "I don't need a doctor," Lucy protested. "I'm pure. Daddy made sure I stayed pure for my sacred purpose." She looked at Margaret with eyes that were too old, too knowing. "Mommy, you don't understand. I chose this. When I turned 13, Daddy gave me the choice to leave or stay, and I chose to stay because I love him." Margaret's heart shattered. The choice David had offered was no choice at all. A 13-year-old who'd been isolated and manipulated since she was 5 couldn't possibly understand what freedom meant. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, "you were taken from your home when you were 5 years old. You were just a baby." "I wasn't taken," Lucy insisted, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a well-rehearsed lesson. "I was chosen. God spoke to Daddy and told him I was special, that I needed different guidance than other children. Everything that happened was part of God's plan to prepare me for my destiny." The paramedics arrived, their equipment clanking. As they navigated the narrow corridor, Lucy shrank away from them, grabbing Margaret's hand with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me to the outside," she whispered urgently. "Daddy said the outside world would poison my soul, make me forget my purpose. I'm supposed to have babies for the new kingdom of God. That's why he kept me safe." Margaret wanted to scream, to rage against the systematic destruction of her daughter's mind. Instead, she squeezed Lucy's hand and spoke in the calmest voice she could manage. "Lucy, I'm going to stay with you. We're going to go somewhere safe, where people can help you remember who you really are." "But I know who I am," Lucy said, confusion clouding her features. "I'm God's chosen vessel. I'm ready to fulfill my sacred duty." As the paramedics gently coaxed Lucy onto a stretcher, Margaret heard Rodriguez speaking into her radio about finding additional evidence. More rooms, more victims, a network that stretched beyond their small town. The horror was bigger than just Lucy, bigger than just David and Thomas. Margaret climbed into the ambulance beside her daughter, who stared up at the ceiling with the glassy-eyed expression of someone whose entire reality had just been shattered. Outside, the church she'd called home for 20 years was now wrapped in yellow crime scene tape, its sanctuary violated by the truth of what had been hidden beneath. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and protesters, their voices, creating a cacophony that followed Margaret even through the heavy glass doors. 3 weeks had passed since Lucy's rescue, and the case had exploded across national news. Pastor's daughter found alive after 10 years. Church basement horror. Sacred trust betrayed. Margaret sat in the victim advocate's office, watching through the window as church members held signs defending David. Free Pastor Whitmore. Religious persecution. Satan's attack on God's servant. Some faces in the crowd had been at her dinner table, had prayed with her through the darkest months after Lucy's disappearance. "The grand jury returned indictments this morning," Detective Rodriguez said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "David and Thomas are being charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and sexual abuse, but we need Lucy to testify." Margaret's stomach tightened. Lucy was staying at a residential treatment facility an hour away, working with therapists who specialized in cult deprogramming. The sessions were brutal, 10 years of carefully constructed lies being slowly dismantled, piece by piece. "She's not ready," Margaret said. "Yesterday she asked when she could go back to her prayer room because the outside world was too loud, too bright. She still believes David saved her." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "The defense is going to argue that Lucy was never held against her will, that this was religious practice, protected by the First Amendment. They need to see her as a victim, not a willing participant." Through the office window, Margaret watched Beth Carlson approach the courthouse steps. The Sunday school coordinator who'd found the first tape now carried a sign reading, "I believe the children." She was one of the few church members who'd publicly supported the investigation. "How many others?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "We've identified 6 confirmed victims so far," Rodriguez replied, "all children who were part of David's special ministry program. 3 families have come forward. The others are still in denial or too afraid to speak." Margaret thought of Helena Morrison, who'd driven down from Portland to testify before the grand jury. Her daughter Emma, now 25, had broken down during her testimony, describing years of spiritual counseling that had left her unable to trust authority figures or form healthy relationships. The office door opened, and Margaret's court-appointed victim advocate entered with a grim expression. "The church board called an emergency meeting," she said. "They're voting on whether to support David or cooperate with the investigation." Margaret wasn't surprised. Half the congregation still believed this was all an elaborate attack on their faith. They'd convinced themselves that Lucy had been living in a special retreat, receiving intensive religious education. Some even suggested that Margaret had fabricated evidence to destroy David's ministry. "Mrs. Henderson came by earlier," the advocate continued. "She wanted you to know that she believes you, but her husband forbade her from testifying. He said the church has to protect itself from lawsuits." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The same community that had rallied around her family during Lucy's disappearance was now fracturing over her rescue. People who'd brought casseroles and organized prayer vigils were now crossing the street to avoid her. Her phone buzzed with another threatening message. "Your lies will destroy this." "Church," read the text from an unknown number. "God sees everything, Margaret. Justice is coming." Rodriguez leaned forward. "We can provide protection if you feel unsafe." Margaret shook her head. She'd already lost her home, her community, her identity as a pastor's wife. What was left to protect? "There's something else," Rodriguez said carefully. "We found architectural plans in Thomas's house. He and David weren't just planning to keep Lucy. They were designing a compound. Multiple buildings, multiple families. They had a list of potential candidates from other churches. The scope of their ambition was staggering. This wasn't just about one stolen child. It was a blueprint for systematic abuse disguised as religious community. Outside, the crowd was growing larger, their chants becoming more aggressive. Margaret could see news vans lining the street, reporters interviewing anyone willing to defend or condemn the accused men. The truth had finally surfaced, but Margaret was beginning to understand that exposing evil and defeating it were two very different things. The apartment was small but filled with afternoon sunlight, a stark contrast to the pink-lit prison where Lucy had spent 10 years of her life. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching her daughter tend to a small herb garden on the fire escape, Lucy's first independent project, suggested by Dr. Kim as a way to reconnect with the natural world. "The basil is growing," Lucy said, stepping back inside with dirt under her fingernails and something approaching a genuine smile. At 16, she was still learning how to express joy without the practiced performance that had been her survival mechanism for so long. "It looks healthy," Margaret agreed, noting how Lucy had instinctively chosen to plant herbs that could be useful: rosemary for remembrance, lavender for peace, mint for new beginnings. Even in recovery, her daughter sought purpose and meaning in everything she did. Dr. Kim had warned Margaret that healing wouldn't be linear. Some days Lucy would seem almost like a normal teenager, curious about music and movies and the world beyond her captivity. Other days she would retreat into the rigid thinking patterns that David had instilled, questioning whether she deserved freedom or if God was punishing her for abandoning her sacred purpose. "I had the dream again last night," Lucy said quietly, settling onto the second-hand couch they'd bought together. "The one where Daddy is disappointed in me for leaving." Margaret joined her, maintaining the careful distance Lucy still needed. Physical affection remained difficult. 10 years of having her boundaries violated had left Lucy hypersensitive to touch, even loving touch. "What did Dr. Kim say about the dreams?" Margaret asked. "That they're normal, that my mind is processing the lies I believed for so long." Lucy picked at a loose thread on the couch cushion. "Sometimes I still wonder if he really did love me, if maybe I misunderstood what was happening." The question broke Margaret's heart every time Lucy asked it, but Dr. Kim had taught her to resist the urge to immediately reassure. Lucy needed to work through these doubts herself, to rebuild her understanding of love and trust from the ground up. "What do you think love looks like?" Margaret asked instead. Lucy was quiet for a long moment. "I think love gives you choices. Real choices, not pretend ones." She looked at her mother with eyes that were becoming clearer each day. "When you found me, you could have forced me to come with you, but you let me decide, even when I was too confused to know what I wanted." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of normal life filtering through the apartment walls. Children playing in the courtyard, neighbors coming home from work, the ordinary symphony of a world that Lucy was slowly learning to trust. The trials had ended 3 months ago. David and Thomas were both serving life sentences, along with 2 other church elders who'd been part of the conspiracy. The wider network Rodriguez had uncovered had been dismantled, though Margaret knew there were probably similar operations still hidden in communities across the country. Lucy had testified, her voice steady as she described 10 years of psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance. The jury had wept openly as she explained how she'd been taught that her suffering was sacred, her isolation holy. "Mom," Lucy said suddenly, using the title she'd only recently begun to feel comfortable with, "Dr. Kim asked if I might want to visit that new church across town, the one where people talk about social justice and healing." Margaret's chest tightened. Religion remained a complicated topic. Lucy associated it with trauma, while Margaret struggled to separate her faith from the betrayal she'd experienced. But Dr. Kim believed that reclaiming healthy spirituality might be part of their healing journey. "What do you think?" Margaret asked. "I'm curious," Lucy admitted. "I want to see if God can exist without controlling people, without making them afraid." She paused. "Will you come with me?" Margaret nodded, understanding that this small step represented something enormous. Lucy choosing to explore faith on her own terms, Margaret choosing to trust again despite everything that had been stolen from them. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, filled with setbacks and small victories, therapy sessions and difficult conversations. But sitting in their sunlit apartment, watching her daughter tend to new growth, Margaret allowed herself to hope. That healing was possible. Even for wounds this deep, real love might eventually triumph over fear.